Okay, for our next panel, we welcome two distinguished scholars to explore the ties between Haiti and New Orleans. Nathalie Dessens is Professor of American History at Universite of Toulouse, author of Myths of the Plantation Society, Slavery in the American South and the West Indies, and From Saint-Domingue to New Orleans, Migration and Influences. Ms. Dessens is a former Rousseff Fellow at the Historic New Orleans Collection. Rebecca Scott is a professor of history and a professor of law at the University of Michigan. She specializes in civil rights, the boundaries of citizenship and historic perspectives, and the law and slavery and freedom. She was a MacArthur Fellow and the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship. Welcome, Professors Dessens and Scott.
Well, first I want to thank Priscilla and the Historic New Orleans Collection and the program committee for having me here. I'm really enjoying the symposium very much, and I want to thank all the other speakers for their very engaging speeches. Among the many population groups that made New Orleans their home and undoubtedly took part in its shaping are the exiles from the Haitian Revolution. Known as the Saint-Domingue refugees, their contribution to vibrant, cosmopolitan 19th century New Orleans has its place in this symposium. Rebecca and myself will share with you our vision of this diverse group that gave a Caribbean touch to the city throughout the 19th century. We envisage this presentation as a conversation aimed at showing the multifaceted group and what they brought with them to their new home. Before even starting, I want to explain to you my recent choice of calling them exiles and not refugees anymore, although they perfectly correspond to the definition of a refugee, that is to say, a person who had to flee their country to escape war, persecution, or natural disaster. I rather choose now the term exile, which similarly represents someone who lives away from their native country, either from choice or compulsion. The reason for this choice is that if the former Saint-Domingueans did not choose to leave their country, if they originally fled in many very different directions, not necessarily choosing their destination, they eventually made New Orleans their home by election. The term refugee, it seems to me, only insists on the imposed flight, while the term exile introduces a measure of choice. Here, the choice of their final destination. The wording is, to me, important, especially in the context of the present symposium. Our conversation will start with a few words on the general context of the migration. Then we will discuss through a few examples the various groups of population that made the flux. In the last decade of the 18th century, just as Anglo-Americans started migrating to Louisiana, the first exiles from the Haitian Revolution made New Orleans their home. In the next 2 decades, that importantly span the last decade of New Orleans' colonial history and the first decade of its existence in the young United States, between 15,000 and 20,000 of them came to Louisiana. 80 to 90% of them remained in the Crescent City. Although individuals and family groups arrived throughout the 20-year period, the movement was marked by successive waves of mass migration. And if you look at the map, you'll see where they originally fled and then from where they moved to New Orleans. The first wave occurred at the time of the Haitian independence in late 1803, and the next two when the authorities of Jamaica in 1803, 1804, and Cuba in 1809-1810, declared French citizens exiled on their islands personae non gratae in response to Napoleon's dispute with Britain and with Spain. Most of those who had to leave these two islands moved to New Orleans. Several thousand refugees who settled on the Atlantic coast of the United States, on the Atlantic coast of the United States, also chose to join their families, friends, and fellow exiles in New Orleans, attracted by the cultural environment they found there. New Orleans was so similar to the society they had left behind that they remained and planted long-lasting roots. New Orleans was indeed the closest they could find to their lost colony in the Americas, despite 4 decades of Spanish rule and the sale of Louisiana to the United States by Napoleon. The population of New Orleans was still overwhelmingly French-speaking. The society the newcomers found upon arrival was a Catholic slave society organized in 3 tiers, as was Saint-Domingue before the Revolution. The incoming population counted 3 numerically almost equal contingents of the 3 socio-racial groups. In January 1810, for instance, the last wave from Cuba, the best documented by the new American officials of Louisiana, counted 2,731 whites, 3,102 free people of color, and 3,226 whom the mayor counted as slaves, but who in practice had lived as free in Saint-Domingue, as Rebecca will show you in a moment. These newcomers who had lived in the French colony of Saint-Domingue before it was shaken by the slave rebellion brought with them an extremely rich heritage. Saint-Domingue was, in the late 18th century, the richest colony in the West Indies, with a flourishing agriculture, a busy harbor, and relatively developed infrastructures. There were hospitals, stores selling luxury goods from Paris, and an intellectual life that could compete with most of the European cities. It had newspapers, libraries, bookstores, 6 theaters, including one which could accommodate 1,500 persons in 3 weekly performances. It even had a Royal Society of the Arts, of the Sciences and Arts, which could boast Benjamin Franklin among its members. Receiving a large group that made the city's population more than double in a few years, of people who had lived in such an environment was a defining moment for New Orleans. The exiles brought with them a strong political awareness and experience, agricultural expertise, and an interest in the arts and sciences. Many among them were educated and opened educational facilities at all levels and for all population groups. They established fencing schools, art schools, they founded newspapers, theaters, and even an opera house. Their influence was enhanced by the timeliness of their arrival. Even as New Orleans was receiving an important influx of Anglo-Americans, committed to bringing with them the common law, Protestantism, a biracial vision of the world, and an Anglophone environment, linguistically and culturally. The Saint-Domingue exiles helped the French-speaking Catholic population remain a numerical majority, well, until the mid-19th century. Together with the people still immigrating from France, they reinforced the Creole group and helped maintain the French language, French culture, and Catholicism in New Orleans. The various groups prevented rapid expansion of Anglo-American influence in all fields. The Anglicization of the slave population, for instance, was slowed down by their input. The free people of color were extremely active in the fight to maintain the privileges of their group. Their descendants, the Dédunes, the Roudanais, the Trévignes, and many more, were among the leaders of the civil rights movement that developed in Louisiana after the Civil War, fighting inequality, segregation, and the stigmatization of racial differences. This contextual presentation is but a very rapid overview of some of the main features of the former inhabitants of Saint-Domingue, whatever their social-racial belonging, who chose New Orleans as their port of call.
Thank you. We're actually going to do this in stages. So that's part one of Nathalie. This is part one of Rebecca. You'll then get part two of Nathalie and part two of Rebecca. So you'll be doing a lot of clapping. Okay. So as Nathalie suggested, I'll focus in on one aspect of the arrival of people from Saint-Domingue in 1809, specifically the presence among them of 3,226 people whom the mayor counted as slaves. And you can read that phrase, 3,226 slaves, in any of dozens and dozens and dozens of things written about this moment. But there are two real puzzles behind that phrase. The first is that federal law categorically prohibited bringing persons into the United States from abroad to sell or hold as slaves. This was a component of the famous ban on the international slave trade that had been passed by Congress, signed by President Jefferson in 1807, and had gone into effect in 1808. So it was thoroughly enforced in 1809. So how then were people arriving from Cuba, clearly outside the United States, to be legally disembarked on the levee in New Orleans as slaves more than a year after a law prohibiting any such disembarkation had taken place? So that's the first puzzle. The second puzzle is the use of the term slaves to refer to these people at all, whether they disembark or not. The great majority of the refugees arriving in New Orleans from Cuba in 1809 were not men and women who'd left Saint-Domingue, Haiti, in response to the uprising of enslaved people in 1791-93. We generally think of these as people who came out in the period of the Haitian Revolution, but they're not coming out in the moment of the uprising of enslaved people. These were instead, this migration consisted of people who had either remained in or returned to Saint-Domingue across the period when the French National Convention abolished slavery, across the period during which the black general Toussaint Louverture was formally recognized by Paris as governor of the colony. So anyone who had once been a slave in Saint-Domingue had been declared to be free, first by a decree and then by legislative action. And anyone who had once been a slaveholder had lost the right to exercise powers of ownership over a person, and had in one way or another adjusted to those circumstances. So I think it's important to keep in mind that at the moment of departure from Saint-Domingue, the people whom we characteristically describe as the Saint-Domingue refugees or exiles, at the moment of their departure from Saint-Domingue, they had not been slaveholders and slaves. There was no longer slavery in Saint-Domingue at that moment. Their flight from the French colony had come instead 9 or 10 years after the abolition. And this is that moment, depending on whether you count it from the decree or from the legislative action. Instead, their departure came in 1802 particularly, and then in 1803, in the context of First Consul Napoleon Bonaparte's effort to crush the regime of Toussaint Louverture and reimpose slavery. Now, Napoleon's forces failed on both counts. They did not crush the power of Toussaint Louverture. They kidnapped Toussaint Louverture, but they did not crush the power of the generals allied with him. And they did not succeed in legally reimposing slavery. There is no legal ruling that slavery is reimposed on Saint-Domingue. But the warfare that resulted from that French expedition in 1802, 1803, and the resistance to it, it's that warfare and the fear of further violence that's the trigger for the departure of thousands of people from Saint-Domingue for Cuba. Cuba under Spain, hence loosely allied with France. So what we think of as the Saint-Domingue refugees are the Saint-Domingue re-refugees, Saint-Domingue to Cuba, then Cuba to New Orleans. Now, it's important to notice then that arrival in Cuba had given former slaveholders from Saint-Domingue the chance to try, in effect, to renew their own lost cause, to try to reverse in practice an abolition they had been obliged to accept as law in Saint-Domingue. And so, upon arrival in Cuba, many began to refer to people of African descent as belonging to them. They would often initially use a term that simply meant servants, criados, but that term in Spanish could easily slip and slide back and forth from servant to slave. Children and women and some men who worked for others out of debt or desperation or dependency within the refugee community in Cuba could find that the fact that they were laboring for other people in a slaveholding society caused them to appear to be owned. And this is one of the great ambiguities and historical challenges of studying this period. What exactly does it mean to say that someone is or was a slave? If they were laboring without pay to repay a debt, then the person who was receiving that labor could begin to perform some of the powers that we associate with ownership. That doesn't necessarily mean that there was any legal title. Now, the Cuban government, the Spanish government in Cuba, posed few significant obstacles to this kind of slippage in status. So a person of African descent, for example, who believed herself to be working for someone who had advanced her money for passage to flee during those days in 1802, 1803, could find that the person she was working for to pay back a debt was now beginning to refer to her as a slave. Might, for example, take a child who was born to that woman to the church and have them baptized as a slave. So it's in this situation of great ambiguity of status that the next big jolt comes, which is in 1808. So the refugees are in Cuba at the moment when Napoleon decides to invade the Iberian Peninsula. And so this suddenly upends everything. They had been allowed refuge in Cuba because Spain was loosely allied with France. Now suddenly France is invading Spain. They're ordered to depart. So the question then we might keep in mind is which of the relationships would hold and which of the relationships would dissolve as boats crossed the Gulf of Mexico, again carrying this population to New Orleans. As they came up the Mississippi toward New Orleans in that spring of 1809, there were men and women who now aimed to hold others as slaves. This meant, however, that they had to thread a conceptual needle. They had to persuade the U.S. government that the federal ban on importing people as slaves did not hold or did not apply to them, but that as soon as they arrived and disembarked, they would be able to hold these persons as slaves. And I've always wondered how they did it. And a couple of weeks ago, I'm going to hope that this PowerPoint is going to move us to an image, and one more image. A couple of weeks ago, I found a document that I had been looking for a long time. It's buried in files in the National Archives in one of those holdings that's described as miscellaneous letters received. Y'all are historians, you know what it's like. Well, it turns out that deep in that microfilm reel is the petition that was sent by Saint-Domingue emigre, refugee, exiles to, they describe themselves as the French of Saint-Domingue who are refugeed in Cuba, and they address themselves to Monsieur le Président des États-Unis d'Amérique. I think they're not quite sure whether when it arrives it's going to be Jefferson or Madison, so it's Monsieur le Président. They apparently drafted it shortly after the expulsion order. It was probably delivered to President Madison after the first boats had arrived in Louisiana. The petitioners, it's very elegant. They declare that they have been buffeted for 20 years by the storms of revolution. They've been expelled from their peaceable pursuits in Cuba. They seek the hospitality of the United States and its wise and learned people. Just one detail, they do wish to be accompanied by those persons whom they describe as loyal domestics, without whose labor they say they would be quite unable to manage. There are 110 signatures on this document. Augusta Elmwood, who I hope is here somewhere, is busy transcribing them so that we can see exactly who signed it. And it arrived probably in the hands of President Madison after the refugees had arrived in Saint-Domingue, after they'd arrived, in New Orleans. So they said that if they could just please bring in these loyal people, qui nous aiment et que nous aimons, they described these as familial relationships of love and affection, they would then be able to rely upon their labor and build up agriculture in the southern United States. Now, everybody understood the subtext. The United States Congress had prohibited of bringing from abroad persons to be held or sold as slaves. What the petitioners were asking for was clearly contrary to federal law. The request was nonetheless granted. Over the next few months, Governor Claiborne allowed those who claimed others as slaves to do so as long as they posted a bond pending a final decision by the federal government. And then in sequence, the United States Congress voted to exempt the arriving ship captains from the ban on the importation of persons to be held as slaves. President Madison signed one after another remission of penalties, effectively pardoning the captains who might otherwise have been deemed to be in violation of the law. Then, in March of 1810, the Orleans Territorial Legislature officially stated that putative owners, they called them just owners, among the refugees could now, quote, possess, sell, and dispose of those who had been categorized as their slaves. So the backdrop to that number that you've read many times, 3,226 slaves. These are, in effect, 3,226 persons who had lived as free people under French law, whose status had often been indeterminate, unspecified, sometimes held as property under Spanish law in Cuba, and who would now be considered slaves under the laws of the United States. The territorial legislature's decision thus took the status term slave and locked it into a framework of property. Even so, those who came in with these individuals did not hold any valid property title to any given individual. They'd been given a blanket authorization. So what I'll do in the second part of my remarks, so you don't have to clap every time, I'm going to sit down, she's going to stand up, and then I'll come back. I'll track the transformation of one freeborn child into a slave through the records that rest in the New Orleans notarial archives. And before I sit down, I'll just call your attention, Augusta has seen these, just two of the many signatures, B. Olive and Félix Doutre, and we'll just hold those in mind. They'll be relevant when I come back up to the microphone. Okay, Nathalie.
Well, you know, we just did that to make sure that you would clap twice. The rest of the exile group, which comprised some 10,000 refugees, progressively merged with the French-speaking population of the Creoles and incoming French immigrants who continued to settle in Louisiana throughout the antebellum period. Their fate was different from the formerly enslaved. They reached Louisiana free and remained free there. They interacted, mingled, intermarried with the other Francophones, and progressively dissolved into the corresponding groups of whites and free people of color. After the mid-19th century, they had disappeared as a group to such a point that they ceased to stand out in the historian's narrative of New Orleans. It was not until the mid-20th century and Gabriel Debien's pioneering work that they reappeared as a group worth studying separately from the rest of the New Orleans population. Yet, there is no doubt that they often stood out, individually or collectively. To avoid sweeping enumerations of what they did and how they stood out, I chose to single out a few individuals and turn them into types. I chose not to deal separately with the whites and the free people of color because I felt it made more sense in the end, and you'll see why. I also chose to give you examples drawn from the first generation, the one born in Saint-Domingue, and from their descendants, born either in Louisiana or, in some cases, in other places of asylum, on their way to Louisiana. And you will see that this division makes sense and enables to draw stronger conclusions on the exiled population. Jean-François Pitot, although he was not born in Saint-Domingue, had married into the island's Creole community. He came to New Orleans in 1796 with the first wave of refugees. In the city, he built the first cotton press, was one of the directors of the Compagnie de Navigation d'Orléans, vice-chancellor of the Collège d'Orléans, and became the first appointed mayor of American New Orleans. He was appointed by Governor Claiborne to the city council in March 1804 and became mayor a mere 3 months later. Pitot epitomizes a whole generation of prominent politicians who occupied high positions, either at the city hall, like Denis Prieur, in the state senate or legislature, like Pierre d'Ormenon, sometimes even becoming the state governor, like Pierre d'Herbigny. Louis-Victor Séjour fled Saint-Marc in 1794. He settled in Louisiana, established a prosperous cleaning and dyeing business, joined the Free Battalion of Color of the militia, distinguished himself in the Battle of New Orleans, was the initiator of the Société des Artisans, founded by free artisans and war veterans of color. Second, Major Savary, also a free Saint-Dominguean of color, commanded the 2nd Battalion of Free People of Color in the militia. The battalion, which counted 250 men, fought in the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, and Savary became the first man of African descent to reach the rank of major in the US Army. Many free Saint-Domingue exiles of color shared Séjour's and Savary's experience in the city. The militia was largely manned by Saint-Domingueans, white and black, and their role in the Battle of New Orleans was essential. Louis Moreau-Lillet had been Deputy Attorney General of the Superior Council at Cap Français. He reached New Orleans in 1804 and immediately started a new career as official interpreter of the territory. In 1805, he became a judge in the Orleans Parish City Court and a member of the Parish Assembly. He became successively member of the State House of Representatives, a state senator, attorney general for the New Orleans City Council. His longest lasting legacy is his co-authoring of the 1808 Louisiana Digest, often referred to as the Civil Code, and revising it with his co-authors in 1822 to produce the full Civil Code of 1825. Many white refugees, like him, became involved in the legal field in New Orleans, although, of course, not all at such high ranks. Louis Duclos was among the first group of exiles, those who came to Louisiana directly when the Haitian Revolution started. In 1794, he founded Le Moniteur de la Louisiane, the first Louisiana newspaper. Because the exiles were highly educated unemployed and without financial means, they found that the lack of press in the old colony was a niche that they could fill. For decades, Saint-Domingue exiles led the world of the press in Louisiana. Le Télégraphe, Le Courrier de la Louisiane, L'Ami des Lois were all founded by Saint-Dominguans. And we'll see that they and their descendants remained active in journalism until well after the Civil War. Not only did they launch the first newspapers, but they, black and white, were an essential part of the writing staff of most newspapers in Louisiana throughout the 19th century. Paul Mathia and Anatole Péchaud had been a planter in Saint-Domingue, and like Henri de Saint-Gemme or Dr. Christian Mittelberger, he returned to his occupation in Louisiana. He became the owner of a 2,240-acre property where some 20 slaves cultivated sugar. Plantation ownership was out of reach for most of the exiles, for obvious monetary reasons, although it was one in which they had expertise because many of them, black and white, had been planters in Saint-Domingue. They found employment as managers, overseers, or technical assistants on sugar plantations. Antoine Morin, a Saint-Dominguean, is credited with being the first to successfully granulate Louisiana sugar on Étienne de Borré's plantation. Auguste d'Avezac, Paul Lanus, and Louis Moreau-Lillet, all from Saint-Domingue, founded the Collège d'Orléans, the first establishment of higher education in Louisiana. Most of the leading positions, from administrators to professors, were occupied by Saint-Domingueans. This is only a small example, since many refugees, black and white, founded schools and taught to the free, black and white, and to the enslaved. As with the press, education was a sector that had remained underdeveloped in colonial Louisiana. And as with the press, Saint-Domingueans not only founded the schools, but they staffed the administration and teaching teams for decades. Jean-Charles Faget settled as a medical doctor in Louisiana and left his name in the medical nomenclature by discovering Faget's sign, the distinctive mark of yellow fever, an uncommonly slow pulse, and enabling the practitioners to differentiate it from malaria and from other fevers. The medical professions were another sector where the Saint-Domingueans shone. Long lists of black and white exiles, doctors and pharmacists and nurses, testified to their essential role in their sector, in this sector. Alexis Daudet was the director of the Comédie du Cap Français. When he came to New Orleans, he remained actively involved in drama. He was actor, playwright, and manager of the Orleans Theater. As in the field of the press, New Orleans lacked entertainment and artistic infrastructures. The refugees palliated this deficit to the point that New Orleans became the undisputed leader in the American South and even one of the leaders in the United States in this sector. Theater, music, opera, ballet, the whole entertainment industry benefited from the exiles' expertise. Many of them had no resources when they came to New Orleans. What they had was an uncommon degree of education compared with the Louisiana population in general. What they found was a cultural and intellectual fabric that was much less developed than what they had known in Saint-Domingue. They found niche that they fully occupied for decades and thus left traces on the city's culture. Of course, not all of the refugees left such a mark in New Orleans, history. Many just quietly joined the silent actors of the city's fabric. They became teachers, journalists, merchants, artisans. They ran cafes, boarding houses, bookstores. They became tailors, bakers, seamstresses. They played music in the New Orleans orchestras, taught fencing, became dance masters, actors, sugar makers. Both white and free people of color of the Saint-Domingue migration became the substratum of New Orleans society, from its very bottom to its very top. And because we are looking into the legacy of the people that made New Orleans, I think it is worth to look into what happened to the next generation. And this step forward in time shows us that if the first generation exiles clearly mattered in New Orleans, their descendants played an equally important part in shaping New Orleans. The next generations provided new leadership in a number of fields which, as will be seen, were culturally significant. The first book ever published in Louisiana, A History of Louisiana, is credited to an exiled son, Guy Sonia du Fossat. The most inventive and talented writers, poets, playwrights were Creoles of color of Saint-Domingue origin. Armand Lanus, Victor Séjour, Michel Céligny, Camille Thierry, and others left enduring mark on Louisiana culture. The book Les Sénelles, published in 1845, is their most famous legacy, with the foundation of the literary magazine, L'Album littéraire, Journal des jeunes gens amateurs de littérature, which was created in 1843. Paul Tulane, the son of a refugee, funded in 1834 the second structure of higher education in Louisiana, the Medical College of Louisiana, which was renamed Tulane University in 1883. Hippolyte Canonge was superintendent of public schools, and generally, the refugees' children followed in their parents' wake and were instrumental in the development of the educational system in New Orleans. I could go on, but we'll take a single last example, of which I'm sure you have heard through his descendant, Marc Roudanet, that of Louis-Charles Roudanet. The son of a Saint-Dominguean, Roudanet became one of the most eminent leaders of what some people call the first civil rights movement, but which I prefer to call the beginning of the long civil rights movement. His career summarizes many of the refugees' descendants' fields of excellence. After getting his PhD in medicine from the Sorbonne in 1853, and a second degree from Dartmouth College, he practiced medicine in New Orleans before founding two newspapers, L'Union in 1862 and La Tribune de la Nouvelle-Orléans in 1864, the first black daily newspaper in the United States, which was published regularly until 1868, but on and off until 1870. He was involved in politics and participated in the elaboration of the 1868 Louisiana Constitution, the most progressive constitution in terms of blacks' rights at the time. His associates in the fight were his brother, Jean-Baptiste, but also Paul Trévigne, Arthur Estève, Rodolphe Lucien Desdunes, and his son, Daniel, who was instrumental in the first fight against segregation. They were all descendants of Saint-Domingue exiles, and I'm sure you recognize many names of people you know, although I pronounce them in the French way, so maybe you don't recognize them. And surprisingly, the second and third generation refugees excelled in the field their parents had launched. The arts, journalism, medicine, and education were their favorite sphere. Although the format of today's presentation does not offer enough space to draw a more thorough picture of their manifold contribution, this kaleidoscopic presentation of a few archetypal figures of the migration reveals that the free exiles, black and white, were instrumental in making New Orleans what it was and what it is, to a large extent. Looking into the first generations of New Orleanians with Saint-Domingue roots teaches us several lessons. They were many, they were everywhere, in every occupation and at every step of the social ladder. They very quickly found their place among the prominent members of the New Orleans community. They were not more prominent than other New Orleanians, but extremely prominent more rapidly than many. The first generation, if it bears testimony to the collective dynamism of the free community of color, tends to distinguish more white people individually, and symptomatically, among the portraits of the first generation I drew, many were whites. The second and third generations, however, tended to place more free people of color in the limelight. This shows that the degree of comfort met by the white exiles upon arrival helped them climb very rapidly to the highest rungs of the ladder. If the free people of color were as predisposed by their Saint-Domingue past to shine, it took them one generation to show their real potential. But all in all, their contribution to New Orleans is both real and significant. Recently, historians have shown that Louisiana followed a Caribbean pattern of French colonization. The arrival of thousands of inhabitants of Saint-Domingue largely re-Caribbeanized it at a time when this identity was being altered by the Anglo-American migration. New Orleans was definitely already a creolized place. The arrival of the Saint-Domingueans re-creolized it linguistically and culturally. The consequences of the Saint-Domingue immigration were significant. In their wake, the Creole language, voodoo, a strongly Caribbean folk culture, gained momentum. They helped New Orleans become the northernmost Caribbean territory by reinforcing its already creolized culture. Moreover, because the immigrants had maintained connections with the exiled diaspora and with Spanish and British colonials they had met and befriended during their stay in Cuba or Jamaica. They were the main actors of the development of exchanges of population, goods, ideas, and culture with the other Caribbean territories. They made New Orleans a landmark of the greater Caribbean.
So to keep us on schedule, I will speak quickly just about one case. I've been trying to figure out, given the circumstances we've talked about earlier, I've been trying to figure out how any actual property title was claimed or forged or fabricated in the person of women, men, and children who had left Saint-Domingue as free citizens of France. It's something of a feat to accomplish. And I think it's accomplished through a kind of alchemy of ink and force. And I've searched through sale records looking to see if I can verify by a birth date a person who was born free in Saint-Domingue. This is the first group I've looked at, and this is the group I'll talk about today. Looking particularly at someone born free in Saint-Domingue precisely to circumvent the question and make it clear that there was no property title to this person that ever existed under any jurisdiction at any time until such moment as someone took it upon themselves to enslave her. So one case that I found that was particularly well documented, and that I'll just review for you in about, just take 2 or 3 minutes, is a child named Sanit. She was born around 1798 in the city of Cap Français in Saint-Domingue, several years after the legal abolition of slavery, born free. Her mother may have worked as a servant, we don't really know. What we do know is that at the age of 4 or 5, Sanit was in the custody of a woman named Marthe Boyer. And Marthe Boyer took Sanit with her when she left Saint-Domingue for the city of Santiago, Cuba, in that first migration in 1803, where they lived within the community of Saint-Domingue refugees in Santiago. Then, when the order of expulsion came after Napoleon's invasion of the Iberian Peninsula, Marthe Boyer boarded a boat, again accompanied by Sanit, who was now about 11 years old. So in the early stages here, we essentially have a process of control over a child. Now, you'll recall that the great majority of men who petitioned President Madison were white. They sought to assert ownership over often numerous persons whom they claimed as slaves, and they were often able to do so by mere declaration, telling a notary that certain individuals belonged to them by inheritance or that they had lost a copy of the title or whatever it might be. But Sanit's situation was somewhat different. Marthe Boyer, who claimed her, was neither wealthy nor white. Notaries in New Orleans listed Marthe Boyer as a free woman of color. And this may be why so many pieces of paper have survived to document that process of enslavement in this case, because it wasn't something that was taken for granted. Marthe Boyer perhaps could not make do with a mere declaration. And she was visibly hard up for cash. So we see the first step of enslavement in the process, that is to say, the process of turning the child who accompanied her into property. In 1811, so just a year after the territorial legislature has said that people can be bought and sold as slaves if they've accompanied incoming refugees, Marthe Boyer borrowed some money from a local merchant in New Orleans, and to secure the loan, she offered a mortgage on the child named Sanit. That transaction was recorded before a notary, and when Boyer defaulted on the payment, the merchant took her to court. This is the kind of process that generates the sort of records that enable us to see something happening that we know was happening many, many, many times, but it's because of the default. It's because it ends up in the civil court records over in the public library. So we see the process in action. Now, Marthe Boyer finally managed to pay the mortgage back by taking out another loan, again offering up Sanit as collateral. This was a bit of a game here. She took out the second loan from Dr. Christian Miltenberger, whom you mentioned, a physician and planter who had been one of the signatories of that petition to Madison. So Marthe Boyer borrowed money, used the child as collateral, paid back the money, held the child in her own service, and then something by 1814 had changed. Maybe Marthe Boyer needed money again. Maybe Sanit, now a teenager, was beginning to ask too many questions about why she had to work for Marthe Boyer. So Marthe Boyer sought to actually transform the child, to actually liquidate her power, transform the child into a slave. First, she filled out what I guess would technically be called a power of attorney, although it mostly looks like a scrap of illegible paper, but it's a little piece of paper that's an inclusion in the notarial archives. It simply says that she conveys the power to make this sale to a man named Louis Pouponneau. Louis Pouponneau, he did this kind of thing for a lot of people. He was a white refugee. He seems to have acted as an intermediary. So she's trying to make this sale, and in order to sell the child, she needs to create something that will be a simulacrum of a proof of title. So it turns out that back in Cuba, she had brought together some of her friends and neighbors to create this rather elegant document that she would later use as a proof of ownership. It simply says, we know Marthe Boyer, and we know the child named Sanit, and we know that Sanit has never had any owner other than Marthe Boyer. A statement which is sort of conceivably utterable, because since she'd never had any owner, she'd actually never had any owner other than Marthe Boyer. But this is the proof now that's going to be offered. And here's where the close-up is kind of interesting. You remember I mentioned B. Olive. You see that name up on the top. And then the second one is Félix Doutre. And when you go to the notarial archives and look at this one, you can see there's something odd around the edges of it. And when you hold it in your fingers, it's too thick. Like, why would the paper suddenly be thick? If you turn it over, this is what you cannot do with digitized records. You turn it over and you feel it and you look, and there's a little line, if you look in the upper right-hand corner there, a little row of stitches. Somebody had cut Félix Doutre's signature out and glued it on as proof that this child was indeed a slave. When we say that people stitched together property relations, we mean something like this. So Sanit then is sold. She's sold to a white Saint-Domingue refugee, someone who's prepared to accept this utterly raggedy patch of proofs. This is part of the complicity within the community. And then we can follow through the notarial archives 5 more sales, year after year, until finally, as a young mother with a new baby, Sanit was sold to Casimir Lacoste, a wealthy planter, perhaps to be used as a wet nurse if he and his wife had a child. I never have found a subsequent sale, nor is she listed in Casimir Lacoste's, among Casimir Lacoste's enslaved people in the documents that are at Tulane. I think she may have been, Sanit may have died in the yellow fever epidemic. So 2 very brief conclusions. The next time that someone repeats that cliche that while slavery seems immoral to us now, back then it was perfectly legal, remember what it took to turn Sanit into a slave. Raise your eyebrows with a degree of skepticism. The experience of the girl named Sanit, the experience of 3,226 other refugees who came into this city and were listed as slaves, confirms that there was in fact a lot of work involved in forcing people with a recognizable, cognizable claim to freedom, forcing them into the status of slaves. Making slavery legal meant pasting law on top of a great deal of force. The second conclusion, we might, as we read in the archives, stay alert to what I've begun to think of. This isn't, maybe, I don't know if this category is a good category, but I've begun to think of it as a kind of culture of enslaving, whether by wealthy planters like those who signed the petition to Madison or ordinary people short of cash like Marthe Boyer, a kind of culture of enslaving that developed not just among the Saint-Domingue refugees, but many of their neighbors. The experience of the child named Sanit is a hint of how the deed could be done. Somewhere in the archives, perhaps, are the stories of the other 3,226 people who had known freedom for a decade in Saint-Domingue, but knew slavery in New Orleans. Thank you.